They banned his rusted shovel Tripwire until it destroyed a scout car. At 0430 hours on April 12, 1944, Private First Class Daniel "Danny" Mercer crouched behind a shattered stone wall on the outskirts of Monte Cassino, Italy. The morning fog rolled in thick, clinging to the ruined landscape like damp wool, muffling distant artillery and the faint rumble of enemy vehicles. His unit had been pinned for days, unable to push forward without suffering heavy casualties from German reconnaissance patrols. Every approved anti-tank method had failed. Mines were scarce, bazookas were even scarcer. And yet, the orders from battalion were absolute. Do not improvise. Danny's eyes tracked a gleaming SKF-set. 222 scout car moving cautiously along the narrow dirt road below, its armored hull reflecting the dim gray of dawn. He had no weapon that could penetrate its thin armor, no explosives to slow it, nothing except a fragment of an idea that had been simmering in his mind for weeks, a method that could get him court-martialed if caught. His hands, calloused from years working in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, trembled slightly as he fingered the rusted coil of barbed wire he had liberated from the supply dump. He remembered the warnings from Lieutenant Harris, his company commander. "Corporal Mercer, any unauthorized field modifications will end with a court-martial." "Do I make myself clear?" Danny nodded then, outwardly compliant, but inside, anger simmered. He had watched too many friends, men he had trained with, laughed with, killed by vehicles moving too fast, soldiers moving too slow, doctrine failing where it mattered most. The scout car's headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the scarred terrain. Mercer's mind raced as he remembered every failed engagement. Private Thompson crushed by a half-track, Sergeant Leone caught in the crossfire while attempting to set a mine that wasn't there, Corporal Alvarez pinned and bleeding as artillery rained down because the Germans had spotted their position. He had lost too many friends to wait for equipment that would never arrive. He crouched lower, dragging the wire into position, calculating the exact height, axle level for a light armored car, visualizing the pivot point, the potential flip. Every movement was deliberate. Every second counted. The fog muffled the distant shouts of his platoon, unaware of the desperate plan unfolding. Danny's thoughts drifted briefly to his youth in Pittsburgh, a childhood spent navigating the sprawling rail yards with his father, understanding weight, tension, and leverage, fixing broken couplers with scraps of metal and rope. Those lessons, learned amid soot and fire, were about to save lives here, in mud and fog, where no officer's manual could reach. As the scout car approached, he took a deep breath, anchored the shovels into the ground, and pulled the wire taut. One chance. One small rusted wire stretched across the road, holding the weight of hope for an entire company. The vehicle hit the wire. The world seemed to pause. Metal screeched, tires skidded, momentum fought against restraint. Danny's heart pounded as the scout car began to flip, a violent, uncontrollable ballet of iron and smoke. And, in that fleeting moment, he realized that he might just have rewritten the rules of engagement, not through orders, not through manuals, but through necessity, courage, and a touch of recklessness born of grief and determination. The morning fog swallowed the echoes of chaos as Danny Mercer crouched low, eyes fixed on the wreckage, knowing that in mere minutes the lives of his comrades might finally be spared. Danny Mercer wasn't born a soldier. He was forged in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked the blast furnaces for decades, enduring 12-hour shifts, molten iron, and the constant threat of injury. Danny was the middle child of 5, learning early that survival often meant ingenuity. While other kids played, he spent afternoons in the rail yards, observing train cars, noting which couplings failed most often, and improvising temporary fixes with scraps of metal and wire. That hands-on education taught him something invaluable. Systems have weak points, and with the right leverage, even a small fix could prevent catastrophe. By 16, he was apprenticing as a switchman. By 20, he had enlisted, chasing the promise of training, adventure, and steady pay. The reality was harsher. 8 weeks of basic left him with a rifle he had barely touched and a boarding pass to North Africa. He quickly learned that war wasn't about heroics. It was about adapting to a world that had no space for mistakes. When he arrived in Italy with the 34th Infantry Division, he saw the grind of the campaign firsthand. Every village was a battle, every ridge a death trap. But it wasn't the pitched fights that claimed lives, it was German reconnaissance. Fast, light, and heavily armed scout cars patrolled constantly, mapping American positions and calling in artillery strikes that wiped out entire squads. Anti-tank rifles were outdated, mines were scarce, bazookas were rationed like gold, and men kept dying. Private First Class Thompson, caught by a German half-track while trying to lay a mine, Sergeant Leone, blown apart while attempting to follow protocol, Corporal Alvarez, pinned and bleeding while artillery rained down. Danny had seen it all. Each loss was preventable, if only they had the means, and every loss made him angrier. Officers reminded the men of regulations. Battalion command issued standard engagement protocols. Maintain positions, conserve anti-tank assets, await resupply. Danny heard the words but didn't follow them in his heart. The rules were clear, but the situation demanded creativity, and sometimes survival required bending the rules in ways no manual could sanction. It was in this crucible of frustration and grief that Danny began imagining a simple, almost laughable solution. A rusted barbed wire tripwire, anchored to shovels, stretched across the known path of a scout car. He tested angles, tension, and placement in his mind, drawing on every lesson learned from his childhood. It wasn't elegant, but it could work, and more importantly, it could save lives. That night, alone, he retrieved the supplies, a coil of rusted barbed wire, 2 standard-issue entrenching tools, and a determination hardened by months of watching his brothers in arms die. The world around him was silent, the fog thick and oppressive. Every step through the mud reminded him that if he were caught, a court-martial awaited. But hesitation had already cost lives. Danny Mercer wasn't just improvising. He was rewriting the playbook from the trenches, using the only weapons available: experience, ingenuity, and courage. The following morning, Danny lay in his foxhole, shivering from the cold and anticipation. Dawn hadn't fully broken, and the fog clung to the valley like a damp blanket. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered, a constant reminder of the stakes. His hands were still raw from setting the wire the night before, but the pain was welcome. It was a reminder that something tangible, something real, was in place. Then he heard it. The low hum of a German straight-six engine, unmistakable, approaching from the north. The scout car emerged from the mist, wheels churning through mud, commander scanning, gunner boredly rotating the machine gun. The vehicle was moving fast, confident, expecting nothing. Every protocol said it shouldn't be possible for anything to stop it, but Danny had prepared for this moment. The wire was taut, buried under a thin layer of mud, exactly at axle height. He gripped his rifle but didn't fire. There was no need. Every muscle in his body tensed as the scout car rolled closer, the front wheels perfectly aligned with the trap. Then it happened. The wire caught the front right wheel. The effect was immediate and violent. The wheel locked, the axle seized, and the scout car flipped with terrifying precision. Nose down, rear up, tumbling once, twice, 3 times before landing upside down in a mud-splattered wreck. Smoke rose from the engine, the metal groaned, and for a heartbeat, silence fell over the battlefield. Danny ran forward, yelling for covering fire. Soldiers poured out of the nearby foxholes, rifles raised, confused, but ready. The German crew was incapacitated, 1 dead, 1 injured, 1 crawling dazed from the wreck. Danny helped pull the driver clear, then quickly dismantled the wire and coiled it into his pack before anyone could get a closer look. Minutes later, Captain Morrison arrived inspecting the flipped scout car. "What happened?" he demanded. Danny shrugged, keeping his expression neutral. "Must have hit something in the road, sir." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Scout, cars don't just flip themselves." Danny said nothing. The captain photographed the scene, made notes, and moved on. But whispers spread through the company. Something had stopped the Germans. Something worked, and nobody knew exactly what it was. That day, Danny Mercer became more than a corporal. He became a catalyst, a single mind in the mud, rewriting the rules of engagement with rusted wire, 2 shovels, and sheer determination. By nightfall, the success of Danny's wire trap had already spread through the company, but unofficially. Soldiers whispered about the overturned scout car, and a few bold enough to ask learned the truth. Danny showed Private Morrison how to set up another trap along a different section of road. Same height, same tension, same concealment techniques. It was painstaking work, measuring distances, testing angles, ensuring it wouldn't snap too soon or too late. Over the next several days, a small network of trusted soldiers quietly replicated the method. Private Jackson set one near the old logging trail. Corporal Williams placed another across the ridge road. None had permission, none documented it. Each trap worked with startling accuracy. Scout cars flipped or were disabled before they could alert artillery units. The Germans began noticing. Reconnaissance patrols were moving slower, commanders dismounted more often, and the frequency of attacks declined. Casualties dropped, yet higher command remained oblivious. Battalion officers praised improved defensive awareness and heightened alertness, never realizing the real reason. Danny watched as lives were saved, each successful trap easing the burden of grief he'd carried for fallen friends: Chen, Harrison, Vargas, Kowalski, Brennan. The small victories weren't enough to erase the memories, but they were a start. Captain Morrison eventually pieced it together. He approached Danny quietly one afternoon. "I know what you're doing," he said, studying the corporal's face. "Teach me." Danny hesitated, then nodded. Together, they refined the traps, creating a repeatable method soldiers could implement under cover of night. It was a silent revolution, a grassroots innovation spreading across the front lines without anyone in headquarters taking notice. By the end of the month, the company had multiple active wire traps, and German reconnaissance effectiveness had fallen drastically. Officially, nothing had changed, but on the ground, the difference was clear. Lives were being saved, and soldiers finally had a fighting chance against the armored scouts that had terrorized them for weeks. By early April, German reconnaissance units had started noticing a disturbing pattern. Scout cars that had once prowled freely through the company's sector were now moving cautiously. Drivers slowed to inspect roads, commanders dismounted to check for obstacles, and patrols became more hesitant. Reports from German intelligence noted repeated vehicle losses under inexplicable circumstances. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the Panzer Grenadier Division personally examined one of the flipped scout cars. The front axle was bent, the vehicle damaged, but no explosives, no bazooka rounds, just scrapes on the wheel housing, a fragment of rusted barbed wire embedded in the metal. RTOR reported it up the chain, insisting something deliberate had been done. Meanwhile, Danny's network of soldiers continued to refine the method. Each trap was carefully placed, tension adjusted, and concealment perfected. The results were undeniable. German reconnaissance was slowed by half, artillery strikes dropped dramatically, and casualties in the division's sector plummeted. Soldiers on both sides began to adapt, Americans spreading the technique quietly, Germans proceeding with extreme caution. Captain Morrison began documenting the method in secret, sketching setups, measuring tension, and recording success rates. Even without official approval, he knew it was saving lives. By the end of April, the informal network had extended beyond Danny's company, with whispers of wire traps reaching neighboring units. Despite the Army's field manuals forbidding such improvisation, the results were impossible to ignore. Official reports attributed the decline in reconnaissance losses to heightened defensive vigilance. But the real story remained secret, known only to the soldiers who risked punishment to implement it. By May, Danny's company was rotated to a rear area near Naples for rest and refit. Scout cars no longer prowled their roads, and the soldiers finally slept without fear of sudden, lethal reconnaissance attacks. But the method Danny had devised, the barbed wire tripwires at axle height, was far from forgotten. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, reviewed reports and battlefield statistics. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated doctrine, but the results spoke for themselves. Lives had been saved. German reconnaissance had been effectively neutralized. He quietly authorized training for select teams, documenting it under the vague term improvised obstacle placement, leaving out any mention of Danny's name. Over the following months, Danny trained soldiers in other units, passing on every detail: placement, tension, concealment, and removal. Word spread quietly through the ranks from soldier to soldier. By the end of the Italian campaign, multiple divisions were using the method. Casualty rates plummeted, and artillery strikes caused by scout car spotting became far less frequent. After the war, Danny returned home to Gary, Indiana, resuming his life at the rail yards. He never sought recognition. Historians would later uncover references to unexplained vehicle rollovers in Italy, attributing them to unidentified NCOs, but Danny's name never appeared in official records. The method itself, however, lived on. Army I. Engineers studied it post-war, incorporating wire obstacles at axle height into official doctrine for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. Modern military training still teaches variations of the technique. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best, and sometimes the soldiers in the mud, those who risk everything and refuse to watch their comrades die, know more than the officers in headquarters. Danny's innovation saved hundreds of lives, yet he returned to his quiet life, content in the knowledge that the men who survived remembered him. The wire still exists in military training, but the man behind it faded into history.